Walk into any college parking lot today. Count the empty spaces. Then ask a 20-year-old when they last thought about getting a driver's license. Most will pause longer than you'd expect. Not because they're embarrassed, because they genuinely haven't thought about it. That pause is not laziness. It is the end of something that took 80 years to build. To understand what Gen Z feels about cars, you have to start with what their grandparents felt. Not the cars themselves, the feeling underneath. In 1955, a 17-year-old in suburban Ohio didn't just want a car, he needed one to exist socially. There were no apps, no streaming platforms, no digital spaces to inhabit. Physical mobility was the only mobility. The car was the key to the only world that mattered. James Dean drove that feeling straight into a cultural myth. Rebel Without a Cause didn't just sell movie tickets, it fused the automobile with youth identity at a molecular level. Every generation after absorbed that fusion without questioning it. The 1960s turned cars into ideology. Muscle cars weren't transportation, they were arguments about who you were. The Ford Mustang launched in 1964 at a price point designed for working Americans, and it sold over 400,000 units in its first year. That wasn't just commerce, that was a generation being handed a symbol they desperately needed. The space race was happening overhead, Vietnam was coming. The Mustang said, you still have power over something, you still have speed. The psychological function of the car was never really about going somewhere, it was about feeling like someone. Hollywood kept feeding that function for decades. Bullitt in 1968, The French Connection in 1971. Every frame of those chase sequences trained audiences to feel that driving was the purest form of self-expression a person could have. The car became the external projection of internal intensity. When Steve McQueen shifts gears through the hills of San Francisco, no dialogue is needed. The machine speaks for the man. Generations of children watched these films and quietly downloaded an equation. Power over a machine equals power over life. Then came the 1980s and the equation got louder. Knight Rider put a supercomputer in a Pontiac Trans Am and told audiences that the right car could be your partner, your protector, almost your identity made physical. Top Gun wasn't about a car, but the same psychology transferred to every speed-based medium. Ferris Bueller's Day Off centered an entire liberation narrative around a 1961 Ferrari 250 GT California. The car wasn't a prop, it was the film's emotional engine. The message, absorbed effortlessly by millions of teenagers, was simple. Without the car, the adventure doesn't exist. Video games extended the classroom into the 1990s and 2000s. Gran Turismo launched in 1997 and sold 10 million copies. It didn't just simulate driving, it simulated desire. Players spent hours earning virtual cars they would never own in real life, learning the visual language of automotive status before they could legally drive. Need for Speed taught an entire generation that cars were the arena where identity got tested. The specific make, the specific modification, the specific color, these were personality statements. The car was a character sheet. Fast and Furious arrived in 2001 and did something unprecedented. It took car culture into communities that had been largely invisible in automotive media. It made the culture feel democratic while simultaneously making it more intense. The films grossed billions precisely because they were speaking to a hunger that had been building across multiple generations and multiple demographics. By the time the franchise released its fourth installment in 2009, the psychological bond between cars and masculine identity was not a subculture, it was mainstream. Now stop. Hold that image. A culture that spent 80 years encoding cars with freedom, identity, status, speed, and belonging, and then place a child born in 2002 into that culture. This is the open loop that needs closing. That child did not grow up without stimulation. That child grew up with more stimulation than any human nervous system had ever encountered in history. Social identity, peer recognition, self-expression, the feeling of speed and control, all of it was available on a 4-inch screen before that child was 10 years old. The psychological needs that cars once monopolized had already been met by something else. Researchers at the University of Michigan found that between 1983 and 2014, the percentage of young people with driver's licenses dropped from 92% to 77%. The decline began before Uber existed, before smartphones were ubiquitous. The psychological withdrawal had already started. What most people misunderstand is that Gen Z didn't reject cars. They were never fully recruited. The recruitment happened through culture, through films and games and music videos and aspirational advertising, and that cultural pipeline was interrupted. When a 15-year-old in 2015 wanted status, they posted. When they wanted speed, they watched. When they wanted identity, they curated. The car was not the only vehicle for those needs anymore. It was not even the most efficient one. Climate anxiety added a psychological layer that has no historical precedent. Previous generations were not handed scientific consensus as children that their consumer choices were contributing to planetary harm. Gen Z was. Research published in The Lancet in 2021 found that 59% of young people aged 16 to 25 across 10 countries felt very or extremely worried about climate change. That anxiety doesn't sit in the abstract, it attaches to objects. A car is not just a car when you've been taught since childhood to see it as a carbon footprint with wheels. The emotional relationship with the object itself becomes contaminated, not through facts alone, but through the psychological mechanism of guilt by association.
Urban identity shifted too. Gen Z is the most urban-identified generation in American history. Cities that built their infrastructure around walkability and transit became the aspirational destination. When the environment doesn't require a car, the brain stops building schemas that center on one. Cognitive maps are formed by experience. A teenager who navigates Manhattan by subway develops a completely different internal geography than a teenager who navigates suburban Texas by car. Neither is wrong, but only one of those teenagers is likely to feel the absence of a vehicle as a psychological wound. What older generations keep misreading as indifference is actually the absence of a specific wound. The car was not just a tool for previous generations, it was the solution to a problem: isolation, powerlessness, invisibility. Gen Z solved those problems differently, earlier, more efficiently in many respects. The wound never formed, and when the wound never forms, the solution feels unnecessary. This is where the deeper pattern emerges. Every generation forms its identity through the tools available to it at the moment its identity is most plastic. For boomers, that tool was the automobile. For Gen Z, it is the networked device. Both are technologies of connection. Both create belonging and exclusion based on access. Both generate status hierarchies. Both become so embedded in daily psychology that the generation that formed around them cannot fully imagine life without them. The difference is not a values failure. It is a timing difference. A different tool arrived at the same developmental window. The car did not lose. The window closed. And here is the reframing that changes everything. When someone from an older generation feels frustrated that young people don't care about cars, but they are actually feeling is something more personal. They are feeling the invisibility of their own formative experience. The car was not just a machine, it was the artifact through which an entire inner life got constructed. Watching that artifact lose meaning feels like watching something intimate get dismissed. It feels like being told the language you speak is no longer relevant. But Gen Z is not dismissing the language. They never learned it. They were born into a different country. The person staring at the empty parking lot and the 20-year-old who hasn't thought about a license are not in a conflict about cars. They are standing in front of the same human need to feel free, seen, and powerful, and realizing for the first time that they each found it in a completely different place. The car was never the point. It was always just the mirror.